want you to picture something before we go any further. It is 1917. You are 300 feet above the Western Front in an open cockpit observation aircraft. Below you, the landscape does not look like land anymore. It looks like the surface of another world. The shell craters run in every direction as far as you can see, filled with gray water, connected by trenches that from above look like the veins of something enormous and diseased. The artillery is firing. The smoke columns are rising, thick and white and slow, in a line that stretches to the horizon. And then something comes down through that smoke. Not a shell, not debris. Something that moves with intention. Something structured. Something that slows as it descends, holds position briefly, and then is gone. You have nowhere to report it. No language for it, no category for it. You write it down anyway. That notebook, and others like it, still exist. And what is written inside them has never been fully explained. There is no good comparison for the Western Front. That is the first thing you need to understand. People reach for comparisons because the human mind needs something familiar to hang an unfamiliar thing on, and every comparison falls short. It was not like any battlefield before it, and it has not been like any battlefield since. It was something the world had not yet produced, and has spent the century since trying to forget it ever did. By 1917, the front line stretched roughly 450 miles from the Belgian coast down through France to the Swiss border. Along that entire length, on both sides, men lived underground. Not metaphorically, literally underground, in networks of trenches and dugouts that had been dug deeper and reinforced and expanded over 3 years of continuous occupation, until some sections had multiple levels, with sleeping quarters and command posts and medical stations all below the surface of the earth. Above ground was where you died. Below ground was where you waited to possibly die. That was the arithmetic of the Western Front, and every man on it understood it within his first week. The landscape above those trenches is the part that stays with you when you read the accounts of the men who were there. The word they use over and over across hundreds of memoirs and letters and field reports is lunar. They call it lunar because it is the only word that captures what sustained artillery bombardment does to Earth over a period of years. The shell craters ran in every direction, overlapping each other, filled with gray and brown water that reflected a sky that was almost always gray itself. The trees were gone, not fallen, not damaged. Gone, reduced to blackened stumps that stood at irregular intervals like the remnants of something that had given up trying. The mud was not mud in any sense the word normally carries. It was a specific, deep, sucking substance that had swallowed men and horses and equipment whole, that moved slowly and had a smell that the veterans never found words adequate to describe. This is where the observation pilots flew. I want you to hold that image because it matters for what comes later. The Western Front from the air in 1917 was not a landscape. It was a scar, a continuous 450-mile scar on the surface of the Earth that was visible from altitude, the way a wound is visible on skin. The pilots who flew observation missions over it were looking down at something no previous generation of soldiers had ever seen from above, because no previous generation of soldiers had aircraft. They were the first people in history to observe a major industrialized war from altitude. And what they looked down on was unlike anything that had ever been looked down on before. And the artillery ran continuously, day and night, with variations in intensity, but rarely with full silence. The sound from above was different from the sound on the ground. The men in the trenches described it as a physical pressure, something that got inside the body. From altitude, the pilots described it differently. They described the front as something that flickered, The constant muzzle flash and detonation visible from above gave the whole line the quality of something alive and unstable, not a living thing running the length of the horizon. And above all of it, rising from the barrages in thick, slow columns that could hold their shape for extraordinary distances in still air, was the smoke. That smoke is the reason we are here. But before I tell you what entered it, I need to tell you something about the men who watched it happen. Because the accounts that follow are only as strong as the credibility of the people who gave them. And these people were considerably more credible than you might expect. Before you decide what to make of what these men reported, you need to understand who they were. There is a version of this story that treats the witnesses as romanticized figures. Dashing young aviators, half mad with altitude and adrenaline, seeing things in the clouds that were not there. That version is comfortable because it lets you dismiss what they reported without having to engage with it seriously. I want to dismantle that version before we go any further, because it is not accurate and it is not fair to the men involved. Observation pilots were not dashing. They were not the aces you have seen in films, rolling and diving in personal combat above the clouds. That was a different job entirely. Observation was the unglamorous, methodical, genuinely dangerous work of flying slow and low and steady over enemy positions and writing down what you saw. You flew a predictable route at a predictable altitude because the job required it. Predictability over the Western Front in 1917 was a death sentence at an unpredictable time. The life expectancy of a newly arrived observation pilot on the Western Front that year was measured in weeks, not months. Weeks. The men selected for this work were chosen specifically for their reliability, their capacity to observe and report accurately under extreme stress. A pilot who exaggerated, who let his nerves color his reporting, who confused what he hoped to see with what was actually there, was worse than useless. He was dangerous. The entire intelligence value of aerial observation depended on the quality and precision of what the pilots recorded. The men who ran those programs knew this and selected accordingly. They were trained to describe what they saw in specific, verifiable language. Distances, dimensions, directions of movement. They used reference points. They cross-checked their observations against maps. When they were uncertain, they said so explicitly, because an uncertain observation noted as uncertain was still useful, while a certain observation that turned out to be wrong could cost lives. These were not men prone to fantasy. They were men trained to be the opposite of fantasy. They were, in the most literal sense, professional witnesses. René Fonck, the French ace who flew observation missions early in his career before transferring to pursuit aircraft, said something that I keep coming back to when I think about these accounts. He said that the quality of a pilot's mind mattered more than the quality of his reflexes. That what separated the men who survived from the men who did not was not speed or aggression, but clarity. The ability to see exactly what was in front of you and respond to what was actually there rather than what fear or hope was telling you was there. These are the men who filed the reports we are about to discuss. Not dreamers. Not men prone to embellishment. Not men with any incentive whatsoever to describe objects over the Western Front that their commanding officers would find embarrassing and inconvenient. Men with every professional and personal reason to report only what they could stand behind. They stood behind these accounts until the end of their lives. That should mean something. And once you understand the specific environmental conditions they were flying in, what they reported will make a particular kind of sense that is harder to dismiss than you might want it to be. To understand what the pilots saw descending through the smoke, you first need to understand what the smoke actually was. This is not a small detail. The smoke produced by WWI artillery barrages was not the thin gray wisps you imagine when someone says the word smoke. It was not dispersed. It was not transparent. It was a physical phenomenon on a scale that most people today have no reference point for. And if you do not understand its properties, you cannot understand why something using it as cover was making a tactically intelligent decision. A sustained artillery barrage on the Western Front involved hundreds of guns firing continuously over a target area that could span several square miles. Each detonation produced a column of smoke that combined burnt propellant, pulverized earth, vaporized metal, and depending on the shell type, the chemical compounds, including white phosphorus and various experimental agents that both sides were deploying throughout 1916 and 1917. These columns did not dissipate the way a single explosion dissipates. They accumulated. They merged. In still or low wind conditions, which the Western Front experienced regularly in the autumn and winter months, a sustained barrage could produce a smoke bank that rose to several hundred feet and maintained density for extraordinary periods of time, only sometimes hours after the guns had stopped. From above, a pilot flying observation over an active barrage described looking down into something that resembled a weather system more than a battlefield. A solid white and gray mass with its own internal movement, its own columns and currents, completely opaque from above and from the sides. Visibility inside it was effectively zero. Anything operating within that smoke column was invisible to aerial observation, invisible to ground observation from any significant distance, and invisible to the men in the trenches directly below who could see nothing above them but the underside of the same cloud that they were breathing. Here is the part that matters. The pilots were not flying through the smoke. They were flying above it or around its edges, which is where you position an observation aircraft during a barrage. You stay at the margins where you can see the target area without being inside the obscured zone. This meant they had a specific and unusual vantage point. They could see the top surface of the smoke columns and the clear air above them simultaneously. They could see things entering the smoke from above in a way that ground observers simply could not. An observer on the ground looking up saw nothing but cloud. An observer in a trench saw nothing but the underside of the smoke and whatever was falling through it toward him. Only the pilots had the angle. Only the pilots were positioned to see something descend from clear air into the top of a smoke column and register exactly what it was doing, which is precisely what several of them reported. They were not looking for it. They were doing their jobs, and it came down right in front of them. Now I want to tell you what they actually saw. I want to do it in their own words, wherever those words survive. And I want you to hold in your mind, as you hear these accounts, everything I have just told you about who these men were and how they were trained to observe. The first account I want to tell you about did not come from a file. It came from a man named Edouard Vasseur, a French observation pilot attached to Escadrille C-46, flying Caudron G4 two-seat reconnaissance aircraft over the Champagne sector in the autumn of 1917. I know about Vasseur because his granddaughter, a woman living outside Lyon, who contacted a researcher in the 1990s after reading an article about anomalous WWI aerial phenomena, still has the notebook he kept during his deployment. Not his official log, his personal notebook, the one he wrote in at night in his billet, in the small hours when the guns had dropped to their overnight rhythm and the men around him were asleep. She read portions of it aloud to the researcher. He recorded the conversation. The recording exists. I have read the transcript. This is what Vasseur wrote on the night of October 14th, 1917, in his own words as translated from the French. He wrote, Today, during the afternoon barrage over the Moron-Villiers Heights, I observed something that I have not reported and will not report because I do not have the language for it in any official document, and because Commandant LaRue has already made clear what he thinks of unusual observations. What I saw was this. At approximately 14:30 hours, during the heaviest phase of the barrage, I was holding position at the northeastern margin of the smoke bank at roughly 280 meters altitude. The smoke column directly to my west was dense and stationary, one of the largest I have observed, rising to perhaps 200 meters and very white at the top where it caught the afternoon light. I was watching its upper surface for debris trajectories, which is standard practice, when I became aware of something above the column. Above it and descending toward it. It was not debris. Debris does not maintain orientation. Debris does not decelerate. This object decelerated as it approached the top of the smoke. It was dark, the color of old iron, and its shape was consistent from all angles I observed it, which tells me it was rotating slowly on a vertical axis as it descended. It was large. Larger than our aircraft. Larger than any aircraft I am aware of. It entered the smoke column at a controlled and deliberate rate, and did not emerge from the base of the column during the remaining 40 minutes I was on station. I do not know what it was. I know what it was not. He stopped writing there. The next entry in the notebook is 3 days later and concerns a card game he lost to his observer. He never mentioned it again in the notebook. His granddaughter told the researcher that he mentioned it once, verbally, to her father, when her father was a young man and Vasseur was very old. He said, "I saw something come down through the smoke at Moron-Villiers that was not ours, was not theirs, and it was not from anywhere I can point to on a map." His son asked him what he thought it was. Vasseur was quiet for a while and then said, "I think it was curious. The way you are curious about something you have not seen before. I think it came down to look at us. I think the smoke gave it a reason to be close without being seen. And I think we gave it a great deal to look at." He died in 1971. He filed no official report. The second account is different in character because it does not come from a personal document. It comes from within the official record, which makes it simultaneously more credible and more troubling, because it means that whatever the man described was considered significant enough by someone in the chain of command to be written down and retained, rather than quietly discarded. The pilot was a British officer, a lieutenant attached to 9 Squadron Royal Flying Corps, be flying BE-2 aircraft on artillery observation duties over the Arras sector in the spring of 1917. His name in the document is recorded only as Lieutenant HFM, which was standard practice for sensitive field reports of this period. The report was filed through normal RFC intelligence channels, and somehow, through a route that the researcher who located it in the 1990s was unable to fully reconstruct. He ended up in the French Service de Renseignement files, rather than in British records where it should have been. Whether it was transferred deliberately, shared between Allied intelligence services, or simply misfiled and forgotten, is not known. What Lieutenant HFM wrote is this. He was on a morning observation run, approximately 0640 hours. Low light conditions, flying at 300 meters over the gun lines south of Arras. A barrage had been running for approximately 2 hours, and the smoke bank was well established, extending roughly half a mile in an east to west orientation below and ahead of his position. He wrote that he first noticed the object when it occluded a gap in the cloud cover above him. His words were, "I was aware of a shadow passing across my upper wing surface that was inconsistent with cloud movement. But I looked up and observed a body of considerable size at an altitude I estimate between 500 and 700 meters above my own position. It was not an aircraft of any type known to me. It had no wings. Its plan form, seen from below, was approximately elliptical. It was moving slowly toward the smoke bank ahead of me, in the same direction I was flying. And as I watched, it reduced its forward speed until it was stationary above the densest portion of the smoke. He wrote that he watched it hold position for what he estimated as 4 to 5 minutes. He was close enough, he wrote, that he could observe that its surface was not uniform. There were features on its underside that he described as regular and geometric in a way that natural objects are not. He wrote, "It was constructed. I am certain of that in the way I am certain of constructed things from long familiarity with them. Whatever it was made." Then it descended into the smoke. He wrote, "It entered the smoke column at a rate I can only describe as unhurried. It made no disturbance of the smoke at its margins that I could detect, which I found remarkable, as I would have expected significant displacement of the surrounding medium. And it simply went into the smoke as if the smoke were a door it had been given a key to. I remained on station for an additional 20 minutes. It did not come back out." He filed the report. A note in the margin of the document, in a different hand, reads, "Witness reliable. Previous reports accurate and verified. Cause of observation under review." Below that, in what appears to be a third hand, "No further action. No further action." I want to pause here and tell you something about that phrase, because in the context of military intelligence documentation, it carries a specific weight that is easy to miss if you are not familiar with how these documents work. No further action does not mean we investigated and found nothing. It means a decision was made at some level of the chain of command that this report was not going to be pursued. That is a different thing entirely. Investigations that find nothing produce documentation of the investigation. No further action produces nothing. It closes a door without recording what was behind it. Someone read Lieutenant H.F.M.'s report, noted that the witness was reliable and his previous observations had been verified, and decided that the correct response was silence. The third account is the one that moves me most, and not because it is the most dramatic. It is the most human. It was told to me, not from a document, but through a chain of people that I trust. A man I will call Thomas, a researcher who spent 15 years working with WWI veteran testimony before his death in 2009, interviewed an elderly French veteran in the late 1980s. The veteran, who was 91 years old at the time of the interview and had served as an observer in a 2-seat reconnaissance aircraft over the Verdun sector in 1916, told Thomas the following story. He and his pilot, a young man from Bordeaux whose name the veteran gave as Marcel, were flying observation over the eastern approaches to Verdun during a sustained German bombardment in the late summer of 1916. The smoke that day was exceptional, the veteran said. He used the word cathedral. He said the smoke columns that afternoon over Verdun looked like the interior of a cathedral, tall and white, and somehow still despite the violence happening at their base. Marcel saw it first. The veteran told Thomas, "Marcel hit my arm. He hit it hard, not the way you tap someone to point something out, the way you seize someone because you need them to look at something before it disappears. I looked where he was pointing, and there it was, coming down through one of the large columns to our north. Not falling, coming down. There is a difference, and Marcel and I both knew it immediately. Falling is what shells do, what debris does, what birds do when they are shot. This was the opposite of falling. It was in complete control of its descent in the way that we were in complete control of our aircraft. It knew exactly where it was going." Thomas asked what it looked like. The veteran said, Like nothing I had a word for. Round, but not like a ball is round, flattened. like someone had taken a ball and pressed down on it from above and below. Dark. Completely dark. No markings. No light. Nothing that identified it as belonging to anyone on that battlefield. Which is the detail that stayed with me, you understand. On that battlefield, everything belonged to someone. Every aircraft had a roundel or a cross. Every shell came from a gun you could point back to. This had nothing, and it belonged to no one fighting that war. Marcel grabbed his arm again as the object disappeared into the smoke and said, "Did you see that?" The veteran said, "I saw it." Marcel said, "We do not report this." The veteran said, "No." Neither of them ever did. Which brings me to the French intelligence file, because the pilot testimonies are one category of evidence and the file is another. And together, they form something that is genuinely difficult to dismiss. The Service de Renseignement file was compiled across the period 1915 to 1918 and covers what the file's index describes, in the dry language of military bureaucracy, as observations of unidentified aerial phenomena in proximity to active artillery operations. The file contains 23 individual documents. 14 are pilot or observer testimonies. 5 are ground observer reports filed by artillery spotters and infantry officers. 4 are what the file calls material analyses, and it is those 4 documents that demand the closest attention. In the winter of 1916 and again in the spring of 1917, French engineering units clearing and examining shell craters in the aftermath of major barrages in the Champagne and Verdun sectors recovered material that they could not identify. The material was found in craters, but the field reports make clear that the recovery teams did not believe the material had been delivered by the shells that made the craters, and the language in the reports is careful on this point. One report states, "The material was found at the crater margin, not the crater base, suggesting deposition rather than impact. Its condition was inconsistent with exposure to the temperatures generated by high explosive detonation. In other words, it had not been in the explosion. It had been placed, or had landed, at the edge of the crater after the explosion had occurred. The material was sent to a laboratory in Paris for analysis." The 4 documents in the file are the results of that analysis. The laboratory findings, summarized across the 4 reports, were as follows. The material was metallic. It had a crystalline structure that the analysts described as unlike any naturally occurring metal alloy they had examined. Its density was inconsistent with any metal in standard military or industrial use at the time. When subjected to the standard chemical analyses available in 1917, it resisted categorization, showing properties that the lead analyst described in the final report as suggesting a composition not achievable with current metallurgical processes. The material did not corrode in the conditions under which standard metals corrode. It did not respond to heat in the expected way. It was, the analyst wrote, a manufactured object whose manufacture we cannot account for. The final sentence of the 4th and last material analysis report reads, "We are unable to determine the origin of this material using any method currently available to us. We recommend further study by specialists in advanced metallurgy." Below that sentence, in the same marginal hand that appeared on Lieutenant H.F.M.'s report, are 3 words: file and retain. Not further study, not specialist referral, file and retain. The file was retained. It sat in the French military archive for decades, neither classified nor distributed, neither investigated nor destroyed. Just sitting there, the way things sit when no one in authority wants to deal with them, but no one wants the responsibility of destroying them either. A French researcher named Gilles Ferriot located it in 1994 while working on a broader project about WWI intelligence records. He published a short paper about it in a small journal that very few people read. He said in that paper that what struck him most was not the content of the documents, but their tone. The men who wrote these reports were not excited. They were not sensationalizing. They wrote in the flat, precise register of professional military men recording things they needed to record. He wrote, "They do not seem to believe they are writing about something extraordinary. They seem to believe they are writing about something inconvenient." That word has stayed with me. Inconvenient. Not impossible. Not unbelievable. Not the product of imagination or shell shock or the particular madness that the Western Front produced in men who stayed in it too long. Inconvenient. Something that happened. Something that was witnessed and documented and physically evidenced. Something that did not fit into any framework that the military or political authorities of 1917 were prepared to accommodate. And so it was handled the way inconvenient things are handled by institutions that have more pressing concerns. It was filed, it was retained, and it waited. The suppression did not happen all at once. That is the first thing to understand about what happened to these reports. Because the word suppression implies a single decision made by a single authority at a single moment in time. A deliberate, coordinated act of concealment. What actually happened was quieter than that, and in some ways more troubling, because it did not require coordination. It did not require anyone to issue an order. It required only the collective, unspoken agreement of institutions under enormous pressure to set aside anything that did not serve the immediate purpose of fighting and winning a war. In 1917, the French military was not in a position to investigate anomalous aerial phenomena. It was in a position of catastrophic strain. The Nivelle offensive had collapsed in the spring of that year with staggering casualties and triggered widespread mutinies across the French army. Entire divisions had refused orders. The military leadership was managing a crisis of morale and discipline that threatened the entire French war effort. In that context, a file of pilot reports describing unidentified objects descending through artillery smoke was not a priority. It was not even a distraction. It was simply irrelevant to the survival of the institution, and so the institution treated it accordingly. The British response was, if anything, even more efficient in its indifference. The Royal Flying Corps in 1917 was losing aircraft and pilots at a rate that made administrative thoroughness a luxury. Lieutenant H.F.M.'s report reached the intelligence system, was noted by whoever wrote the marginal annotation, and was presumably transferred to French files, either deliberately as a matter of Allied intelligence sharing, or accidentally as one document among thousands moving through an overwhelmed system. Either way, the RFC retained no copy that any subsequent researcher has been able to locate. The report simply left the British system and did not leave a trace of its departure. Thomas, the researcher I mentioned earlier, spent 3 years in the late 1980s and early 1990s attempting to locate RFC records that might corroborate or expand on the accounts he was collecting from veterans. He told his colleagues that what he found was not evidence of deliberate destruction. He found evidence of indifference so complete that it amounted to the same thing. Reports that should have been cross-referenced were not. Accounts that should have been followed up were noted and filed in categories that ensured no one would go looking for them. He said, "They did not bury these things. They just never picked them up." And in an archive, something that is never picked up eventually becomes invisible. The French file that Ferriot located in 1994 survived for a different reason than you might expect. It did not survive because anyone protected it. It survived because the French military archive system of that period used a retention policy that defaulted to preservation in cases of uncertain classification. The file had never been formally classified, which meant it had never been formally reviewed for destruction, and it occupied a bureaucratic category that translated roughly as pending further determination, and in that category it sat for 76 years while the determination never came. When Ferriot published his paper, the response was minimal. 2 letters to the journal, one skeptical and one cautiously interested, and then silence. He attempted to have the material analyses in the file subjected to modern metallurgical testing, and was informed by the archive that the physical material was not present. Only the analytical reports describing the material had been retained. The material itself, the actual recovered samples, had been separated from the file at some point between their original analysis in 1917 and Ferriot's examination in 1994. Where they went, whether they were transferred to another institution, reclassified under a different archive reference, quietly disposed of, or simply lost in the movement of documents across 76 years and 2 subsequent world wars, is not known. Ferriot said in an interview conducted shortly before his own death in 2003. The absence of the material is the most interesting thing about the file. The reports describing it are extraordinary. But reports can be questioned, can be attributed to the limitations of 1917 analytical methods, can be explained away by a determined skeptic. Physical material cannot be explained away. Physical material has to be tested or destroyed. Someone understood that. Someone made a decision about those samples that we have no record of. I do not think they were lost. I think lost and removed look identical from the outside, and I think that is not an accident. What the French file contains today is what Ferriot found in 1994. The same 23 documents, the pilot testimonies, the ground observer reports, the 4 material analyses describing something that should not have been in those shell craters, the marginal annotations in the unknown hand. All of it sitting in an archive in Paris in acid-free folders that the archive staff will produce for any credentialed researcher who requests them, because there is no reason not to. No one powerful enough to care is still alive. The war that produced these documents ended 106 years ago. The men who wrote them are long dead. The file is available. It is just not read. Ferriot was right about one thing above all others. He said that the most revealing detail in the entire file was not what it contained, but what it did not contain. There is no document in that file, not one, in which any authority at any level of the French or British military machine asked the question that any rational institution confronting this evidence should have asked. Nobody ever wrote down, what were these things? Nobody ever asked. Let me tell you what stays with me most about this story. Not the objects themselves, not the metallurgical reports describing material that should not exist, not even the marginal annotations in that unknown hand, though I have thought about those annotations more than I can reasonably explain, about the person who wrote them, about what they knew that they chose not to record. What stays with me is the veterans. Vasseur writing in his personal notebook at night, in the small hours, when the only space available to him where honesty was permitted. Not filing a report, not telling his commanding officer, writing it down for himself, because something in him understood that what he had seen needed to exist somewhere outside his own memory, even if it could never exist in any official record. His granddaughter reading those words 60 years later to a researcher with a tape recorder in a house outside Lyon. The words surviving because one old man could not let them die with him. Marcel hitting his observer's arm. Hard. The way you grab someone when you need them to see something before it is gone. And then 2 men flying back to their aerodrome in silence, making a decision together without discussing it. A decision that held for the rest of their lives. We do not report this. No. The veteran telling Thomas about it 7 decades later not because he had decided it was finally safe to speak, but because he was 91 years old and understood that he was running out of time to say it to anyone. Lieutenant HFM, whoever he was, writing the most precise and careful account of something extraordinary that I have read in a military document, noting the shadow on his upper wing, the elliptical plan form, the geometric features on the underside, the way it entered the smoke without disturbing its margins. Filing the report through proper channels because that was what a professional witness did. Because his training told him that what he observed deserved to be recorded, regardless of what anyone decided to do with the record afterward. Someone decided to do nothing with it. And here is the question I keep arriving at, the one I cannot find a clean answer to, and have stopped trying to force one onto. If what these men observed was something explainable, something that the authorities who received their reports recognized and understood, then the silence makes sense as a security measure. You do not publicize your knowledge of an enemy capability. You contain it and you use it. But if what they saw was something the authorities did not recognize, did not understand, and could not explain, then the silence means something else entirely. Plus, it means that the people in charge looked at the same evidence we are looking at now and made a deliberate choice to look away. I do not know which of those things is true. I am not sure the distinction is as comforting as it sounds. If you have come across accounts like these, from this war or any other, I want to hear from you. Leave it below. This is exactly what this channel exists for.